So once we've been able to discuss the breakup of the Union, the next most logical thing to discuss is the Civil War itself. This is going to be very brief. I apologize. Some of you may be very interested in the Civil War, but unfortunately, New York State places a little value on this when it comes to the Regents exam. So some of the advantages at the beginning of the Civil War. The Union had an extremely large population, so this allowed them to fill the void of any casualties during the war. They also had many economic resources. Industry and foodstuffs, agriculture provides for the war effort. The South had very little industry and only grew cash crops, not food, so they couldn't really support their war effort that well. Here is a photograph of a northern textile mill. Abraham Lincoln provided far better political leadership to the North than Jefferson Davis ever could have for the South. The North was also a recognized nation throughout the world, while the South had to establish foreign relationships from scratch. And lastly, naval superiority. The South barely had any ships, and the North had a large number from the U.S. Navy. Morally, Abraham Lincoln holds the high ground over Jefferson Davis. And James Longstreet, who was mentioned and quoted in our last presentation. Another quote from the movie Gettysburg, Lieutenant General James Longstreet is portrayed by Tom Berenger, and he says, "No nation will ever support a confederacy that allowed for the institution of slavery." You know that, and I know that. He is referring to the difficulty the South was having getting support from foreign countries. The Confederates did have some advantages. Much of the fighting of the Civil War took place in the South, so strategic position and an intimate knowledge of the terrain was a big advantage for the South. They could fight defensively rather than having to go on the offensive. Southern lifestyle made them better at shooting and riding. Northerners, on the other hand, did not have these skills, so the Union Army had to train very raw recruits. Southerners were much more ready to fight from the very beginning. The South had all the best generals, and the North had very few quality military leaders. So military leadership is another advantage of the South. Southern soldiers felt they were defending their homeland, whereas Northern troops didn't really have a defined cause that they were fighting for early on, other than the preservation of the Union. So morale is another advantage in the South. Uniform production alone made the Union Army simply look more prepared to fight a long Civil War. The Confederate armies seemed to be much more ragtag units thrown together. Prepared for the short term, the Confederates didn't really hold out long enough and lost due to the Union's long-term advantages. So the North has the long-term advantage. Hence, Lincoln's plan. He wanted to gain control of the Mississippi River to divide the Confederacy and surround its most powerful states. He wanted to blockade the South to cut off supplies to them, and he wanted to use the northern population advantage to field larger armies and inflict heavy losses on the Confederacy that they simply could not suffer. This is known as the Anaconda Plan, because if you look at this map, once the blockade of the South is instituted, the Atlantic Ocean is part of a network that surrounds the South. You also have northern free states and border slave states, and then one of the major goals being gaining control of the Mississippi River, which would effectively surround most of the most important areas in the South. So the war played out just as one might assume, given the strengths and weaknesses of each side. In the first year or two, the South wins most of the battles. They win the first and second battles of Bull Run, a major victory at the Battle of Fredericksburg, and a rout at the Battle of Chancellorsville. However, in late 1862 and into 1863, the North begins to turn the tide of the war. They turned back a Confederate invasion of the North at the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862. They turned back another Southern invasion of the North at the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863. From May to July of 1863, the Siege of Vicksburg ended with the North taking control of the Mississippi River, which was part of Lincoln's Anaconda Plan. From 1864 to 65, the North more or less finishes the South. The Battle of the Wilderness and the Battle of Spotsylvania, they're more or less draws, but there are such heavy Confederate losses that they really can't replenish their ranks. General Ulysses S. Grant knew this and simply kept pushing. He actually got the nickname the Butcher by his own Union soldiers because he would simply throw men into battle knowing that the South could not replace their losses, and he could. Sherman's March to the Sea is a good example of total war, in which William Tecumseh Sherman and his troops marched from Atlanta to Savannah on the Georgia coast, burning almost everything in their path. Finally, Lee is forced to surrender in Appomattox, Virginia, because he really just can't resupply his army. Here is a photograph of Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee meeting at Appomattox. And here is a show of respect outside of the home in Appomattox, where Union soldiers stood at attention and saluted even their Confederate counterparts after the surrender. This was supposed to be a gesture of kindness as the nation moved into Reconstruction. Unfortunately, Lincoln is assassinated and the nation moves into a very scary period in Reconstruction. This is the end of the presentation. Please make sure that you take the online quiz. Use your notes so that you can get a perfect score. Thank you. See you in class.